One light glows in the winter air, a slipper of sugar, a wish laid bare. Lanterns flicker, the castle sighs where dreams come true, and magic flies.
One slipper, one flame, one winter wish. Come see what awaits when courage and kindness burn together.
Cinderella at the Winter Castle. Part 1. The Winter Castle prepares. Snow had fallen through the night, soft as down shaken from a pillow, and by morning the Winter Castle seemed carved from ice in wonder. Its towers gleamed white against the sky. Its windows glowed with like golden firelight, and every ledge was dressed in frost. Icicles hung like strings of crystal bells, each one catching the sun and scattering it across the courtyard. The whole castle looked ready to sing. Inside, the air was alive with the scurry of paws and the hush of preparations. The mice of the castle, clever, busy, and proud, hurried through hidden passages and narrow halls, their whiskers trembling with excitement. The Winterlight Festival was only a day away, and everything must be made perfect. From the kitchens came the rich perfume of spiced bread rising, of cider warming, of sugared nuts crisping on pans. The smells drifted into the corridors, sweet and steady, carrying a promise of feast. A pair of young mice balanced a crumb of bread between them. It was as large to them as a loaf to a man, and carried it away with laughter, saving it for their family's table. Every mouthful mattered, and no morsel was wasted. Along the skirting boards, garlands were being stitched from holly leaves and threads of straw. Each berry gleamed red against the green, bright as fire. Strings of dried orange peel hung beside them, releasing sharp and cheerful scents when touched. The mice believed that pine and citrus kept the shadows away, so they worked carefully, hanging each string with reverence. "Mind the lantern," one mouse called, steadying a walnut shell filled with wax. Inside the shell, a wick leaned, waiting to be lit. Hundreds of such tiny lanterns would glow during the festival, each one shining like a star in the grand hall. To a human, they were no bigger than a thimble. To a mouse, they were lamps strong enough to light a world. Bells were polished next, rubbed with cloth until they shone bright enough to catch candlelight. The castle mice loved their bells, for they believed each ring carried a wish skyward. One small mouse leaned close to her polished bell, whispered a hope for her family's good health, and then tucked the bell back into its place, cheeks warm with pride. Up in the ballroom, the chandeliers already sparkled, but the floor had to be polished smooth. Mice darted across it with brushes made of straw, sliding and twirling as they worked. Each slip and glide left the tiles gleaming until the whole room seemed to shimmer like frozen lake water. When they were done, a group of young ones practiced bowing, their reflections rippling beneath them. For a moment, their shadows looked like kings and queens themselves. And always, there was the sound of snow brushing against the high windows, snow settling in the courtyard, snow crunching as more mice hurried in from outside. They came bearing twigs of cedar, pine cones still dusted white, and little red berries strung on thread. Some were castle mice who had ventured out at dawn. Others were town mice just arriving with gifts. Their sleds squeaked as they pulled them across the snow, baskets bumping, laughter carrying on the frosty air. The castle mice welcomed them at the gates, tails twitching with pride. This was their home, their hearth, their heart. and during the Winterlight Festival, it belonged to everyone. Town mice and castle mice alike would gather under the same roof, warming their paws at the same fire, lifting their voices in the same songs. In the corners, whispers rose. Some said this year the Prince of Bells would greet the guests himself, his voice as steady and warm as the hearth. Others said the chandelier would sparkle brighter than the stars. Still others swore they had seen the first lantern already lit, glowing deep in the pantry hearth. The winter castle was ready, nearly ready, almost ready, and the mice, though small, carried their work like giants, placing holly, polishing brass, setting lanterns one by one. The festival would come soon. The bells would ring, the garlands would sway, and the halls of the winter castle would glow with more than candles. They would glow with joy. Part 2. Cinderella Mouse and the Hearthlight. In the deepest corner of the winter castle, where the great hearthstones kept the walls warm even on the coldest nights, lived a small and gentle mouse named Cinderella. The castle folk called her that not because she was grand, but because she was often found dusted with ashes from sweeping the hearth. When the fires burned low, she would stir them back to life. When the embers cracked, she would hum to them as though they were children drifting to sleep. Her fur was the soft brown of toasted bread, her eyes dark as polished chestnuts. She was neither the boldest nor the loudest of the mice, but she carried herself with a calmness that drew others close. Even the smallest mouse knew that if you came to Cinderella with a torn cloak, she would stitch it. If you were hungry, she would share her crumb. If your lantern guttered, she would light it again from her own candle. Her mother, long gone now, had left her with words she kept like a jewel in her heart. Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost. Whenever her paws grew weary, or her sisters mocked her, she repeated those words to herself. They were not just memory, they were fuel. The pantry was her kingdom, if such a word could be used for so humble a place. Barrels of grain stood like towers, sacks of flour like white mountains. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, for the kitchens stored their spices here in tiny jars. And whenever a jar cracked, Cinderella gathered the crumbs and wrapped them in cloth sachets to keep the air sweet. She swept, she tidied, she polished, and she sang. Her voice was low and silvery, more hum than song, but it carried through the pantry like a thread of warmth. The embers seemed to glow brighter when she sang, and the shadows curled close, listening. Sometimes even the castle bells seemed to echo her tune, faint and far away, as if in answer. Her step-sisters, Thistle and Poppy, rarely lifted a paw to help. Thistle was sharp as her name, her tongue always prickling with unkindness. Poppy was softer in tone, but no less cruel, her laughter often coming at Cinderella's expense. They wore cloaks stitched with shining thread and boasted of the festival. Yet when their garments needed mending, it was Cinderella who sewed. When they spilled flour or cider, it was Cinderella who cleaned. When their lanterns burned out, it was she who relit them, offering her flame without complaint. "Why do you always smile?" Poppy teased once, watching her polish a copper pot until her reflection shone. "Because smiles make the work lighter," Cinderella answered, and kept on polishing. In truth, her smile came not from ease, but from endurance. Each task she completed was a stitch in the tapestry of her hope. She dreamed of the festival not as a place to be seen, but as a chance to stand among others and feel, just for a moment, part of the song, On this particular morning, she lit a small candle from the hearth. Its flame trembled at first, then steadied, bright and sure. She placed it in a little glass cup she had polished the night before and whispered, "For Mother." The light flickered as though in reply, and warmth spread through her chest. No one saw her do it. Thistle was busy admiring her own reflection in the polished brass, and Poppy was whispering about which mouse she hoped would bow to her first at the festival. Yet the candle seemed to glow more brightly, for being lit in secret. Cinderella returned to her chores, sweeping crumbs into a neat pile, folding scraps of cloth, humming to herself. She touched the candle again and whispered, "Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost." Above her, in the ballroom, music was already being rehearsed. She could hear faint strains of violins, high and trembling. The notes drifted down the stairwells, meeting her song, and for one moment, the pantry felt as grand as the ballroom itself. She closed her eyes and imagined herself stepping out from the shadows into the lantern glow of the hall. Not in finery, not in grandeur, but simply as herself, seen for what she was. That dream was enough to keep her candle lit, to keep her heart warm, even when the ashes smudged her fur and her sister's laughter tried to chill her bones. And so the hearth light shone, steady and small, in the pantry corner of the winter castle. A single flame carried by a single mouse. Part 3. The Arrival of the Town Mice. The morning of the festival dawned clear and bright, the air sharp with frost. A hush hung over the courtyard of the winter castle, broken only by the creak of snow beneath tiny sleds. The town mice were arriving, from the hills and hollow trees, from bakeries and cobblers' shops, from barns and chimneys, and the corners of busy kitchens, they came. Little lines of mice pulled sleds fashioned from walnut halves and matchboxes, their runners squealing cheerfully against the packed snow. Baskets bumped along behind them, filled with gifts for the castle hosts. Pine cones tipped in frost, berries dried and strung on thread, and crumbs of sweet bread wrapped in crinkling paper. The castle mice hurried to greet them at the gates, whiskers quivering with delight. It was a proud moment each year when the town mice came. Together they would share not only food and music, but stories, the kind of tales that warmed the air even more than the hearth. Cinderella stood in the pantry doorway, brushing flour from her paws, and watched them arrive. She loved this part best, the bustle of paws, the calls of greeting, the smell of pine carried in with every sled. A pair of young town mice rushed past, dragging a garland twice as long as themselves, laughing as they went. She smiled and stepped aside so they wouldn't trip on her broom. "Out of the way, pantry girl," snapped Thistle as she swept past, her cloak lined with silver thread. "The guests don't need to see ash on their welcome." Poppy trailed behind, smirking. "Unless you mean to sweep the snow from their sleds." The two sisters giggled, then darted forward, eager to show themselves among the arrivals. Cinderella bowed her head, but her smile lingered. Let them laugh, she thought. The festival was bigger than their cruelty, and the warmth she felt from seeing the town mice return, safe and merry, was too strong to be dimmed. In the ballroom, preparations redoubled. The chandeliers shivered with candlelight, throwing sparks of gold across the polished floor. Long tables were set with thimble-sized cups for cider and tiny plates for sugared nuts. The castle mice rehearsed the midnight waltz, paws gliding in neat circles, tails flicking like ribbons. The town mice, weary from their travels, were shown to corners warmed by lanterns, where they unwrapped their gifts. One laid a pine cone on the table. Another presented a string of dried rose hips. The gifts were not large, but they were given with love, and the room seemed brighter for each one. Cinderella offered her help quietly, unseen by most. She carried baskets from the door to the hall, fetched warm water for travelers' paws, and polished lanterns so they glowed more steadily. More than once she slipped away to the pantry to fetch a scrap of bread or a spoonful of spice to share. No one thought to thank her, but that never mattered to her. She did it because it felt right, because her mother's words glowed in her memory. Kindness is a light. By afternoon, the castle was buzzing with music and chatter. The younger mice darted about in games, hiding beneath the tablecloths, squealing with laughter when they were caught. The older ones gathered near the fire, telling stories of winters past, of storms weathered, and of lanterns kept lit against the dark. The smell of roasted chestnuts and cider spread through the air, wrapping everything in warmth. Cinderella watched from the pantry door, humming to herself. Her heart was full, though her paws were empty. She longed not for finery or praise, but to join the circle, just once, to dance or share a story beside the fire. But the embroidered invitations had gone to Thistle and Poppy. None had been left for her. Still she whispered to her candle as she passed it, "I carry my own light." The flame flickered, as though in answer. Above, the bells of the castle chimed softly, as if practicing for the night to come. The sound echoed down the corridors, brushing over her like a promise. And so the castle swelled with voices and footsteps, with garlands and laughter, with mice from town and castle alike, preparing for the grandest Winterlight Festival yet. Cinderella stood quietly among them, her heart glowing like a lantern in her chest, unseen but steady. Part 4. The festival begins. Evening fell like velvet over the winter castle, and with it came the long-awaited glow of the festival. The first lanterns were lit in the courtyard, their small flames bright against the gathering dark. One by one, mice touched their wicks to the fire, carrying little points of light into the castle, until every corridor shimmered, as though stars had come to live upon the walls. The great hall itself was transformed. Garlands of holly looped from beam to beam, each berry shining red as if painted fresh. Strings of dried citrus perfumed the air with a sweet, sharp tang. On the long tables, plates were piled with sugared nuts, tiny cakes dusted white with sugar, and thimble-sized cups of cider steaming gently. The chandeliers above glittered with 100 candles, scattering gold over polished tiles. The music began softly, a violin string trembling like ice across glass. A flute joined, airy as a snowflake. Soon a drum beat carried them forward, steady and sure, until the room was filled with music that seemed to make even the garlands sway. The mice entered in pairs, tails curled neatly, whiskers shining. Castle mice and town mice alike bowed and spun, paws gliding across the floor in patterns as old as memory. The midnight waltz had begun, not yet at its height, but already filling the room with beauty. The bells chimed in rhythm, deep and warm, as though the castle itself kept time. Cinderella watched from the pantry doorway, a broom still in her paws. Her sisters swept past her in cloaks of shining thread, their eyes bright with pride. Thistle leaned close to whisper something cruel, but the music carried her words away, and Cinderella hardly heard. She was listening too intently to the violin, to the flute, to the rising voices of the mice who sang between dances. The pantry smelled of ash and bread, but beyond it lay a world of candlelight and song. For a moment, she let herself imagine stepping forward, not as a servant, but as a guest. She pictured her paws fitting into the pattern of the dance, her voice joining the carols. Her chest ached with the wish of it, yet she held her smile. Wishes, like embers, had to be tended carefully. The castle mice worked hard to welcome the town visitors. A group of them scurried about carrying trays of sugared nuts, balancing them with careful paws. Others refilled cider cups. Their tails curled to steady the jugs. A pair of little ones tugged at the ropes of the chandelier, adjusting the candles so their light spread evenly across the floor. Laughter rose as the mice played games between the dances, sliding across the polished tiles, hiding behind garlands, chasing one another with snowflakes carried in on fur. The younger mice were giddy with joy, their cheeks flushed from cider and song. But for all the bustle, Cinderella remained at the edge. Each time she stepped forward, broom in hand, someone brushed her aside. Not now, pantry girl. Mind the crumbs. Sweep later. So she stayed in the doorway, watching, her heart both heavy and glowing. She touched the candle she had carried earlier from the hearth, hidden now in the folds of her apron. Its light was small but steady. She whispered to it, "Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost." Above, the Prince of Bells appeared at last. He entered quietly, with none of the boasting the sisters had described. His cloak was simple, trimmed with frost, but when he lifted his paw to greet the guests, the bells themselves seemed to hush, as though listening. His voice carried through the hall, warm as fire, steady as snow. Tonight we gather not only to dance, but to remember that light belongs to all. Each lantern lit, each bell rung, each crumb shared. It is a promise that no one faces the dark alone. The mice bowed, murmuring their agreement. Even Cinderella, half hidden in shadow, felt his words settle into her chest like a gift. The music swelled again. Lanterns glowed brighter. The castle seemed alive, singing, breathing, sparkling. It was the Winterlight Festival in all its glory. And though she stood at the edge, ash on her fur and broom in her paw, Cinderella's heart was already inside the dance. Part 5. The Forgotten Invitation. As the music swelled in the ballroom, Cinderella slipped back to her pantry, the broom balanced in her paws. The lanterns flickered on the walls, painting golden rings across the stone, but none of them seemed meant for her. In the hallway, she passed Thistle and Poppy, their cloaks glimmering with silver thread. They were giddy with talk of the midnight waltz. "Did you see the prince bow to me?" Thistle boasted, smoothing her fur. "He smiled at me twice," Poppy answered, her whiskers twitching. Then both turned to Cinderella. "You'll be keeping the hearth warm, I suppose. Someone has to, after all." They swept past her, laughing softly, not with cruelty sharp enough to cut, but with the casual dismissal that stings more deeply. Cinderella let them go. She knew their words were meant to shrink her heart, but her heart had its own flame. It flickered as she whispered her mother's words again. "Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost." When she reached her cubby in the pantry, she found it bare. No embroidered envelope waited there. No folded invitation. The other mice had each received theirs. Bright slips of paper sealed with wax, a token of belonging. Even the youngest mice had them tucked proudly into their belts or pinned to their cloaks, but not her. Cinderella's paws hovered over the empty shelf, then dropped. She turned back to the hearth, sweeping slowly. The embers cracked and sighed, their light low but steady. She bent close and whispered, "It's all right. I am here. I will carry my own candle." She struck flint and coaxed one small flame to life. The candle she placed beside the hearth was plain, its wax uneven, its light barely more than a glow. Yet to her, it was treasure. She'd polished the glass cup herself. She'd trimmed the wick with care. And she had lit it not with bitterness, but with hope. In the great hall above, music rose louder, paws spun on polished tiles, and laughter carried. She heard it faintly, as though through water. The sound was lovely, but also distant, like a star you can see but never touch. Still she worked, folding scraps of cloth, stacking kindling, sweeping flour from corners. She worked until her paws ached, until the candle's flame began to tremble. Yet each time it flickered, she steadied it with her breath. Carry it still. At last she sat by the hearth, gazing into the glow. Ash smudged her fur, but her eyes were bright. She hummed a tune, low and steady, the same lullaby she had once heard from her mother. It filled the pantry like a thread of silver, soft enough to go unnoticed by those in the ballroom, strong enough to keep her heart from sinking. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, bells chimed softly, counting down the hours. The festival would reach its height at midnight. She would not be there, not in cloak or gown, not in garland or song. And yet, she was not without light. The candle answered her song with its quiet glow. She closed her eyes, her paws folded in her lap. For a moment, the room seemed warmer, as if the very air leaned close to listen. Then, so faint she almost thought it imagined, a whisper brushed her ear. A voice like frost melting, like snow falling on leaves. "You lit your own way." Cinderella startled, glancing about. The pantry was empty, but for the candle, the broom, the sacks of flour. Yet the air seemed to shimmer, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the shadows. She bent close to the flame, her whiskers trembling. The whisper came again, softer still. "And I will show you the rest." The embers gave a sudden crack, sending up a shower of sparks. The light danced across the stones, bright as stars in miniature. Cinderella's breath caught, her paws pressed tight together. She felt the air shift, as if a visitor was already near. And though she did not yet see her, she knew the night was not finished with her. Part 6. The Winterlight Visitor. The pantry was still, save for the quiet crackle of the hearth and the single candle trembling in its glass cup. Cinderella leaned close, whiskers brushing the glow, wondering if the whisper had been only her own wish speaking back to her. Then the air shimmered. At first it was only a glint in the ashes, like frost catching starlight. Then it grew brighter, rising and swirling, until a shape stepped gently into being. She was no ordinary mouse. Her fur was white as snowfall, tipped faintly in silver. Her cloak shimmered like moonlight stretched thin, and her tail, long and graceful, trailed a dusting of frost wherever it touched the stone. "Who are you?" Cinderella whispered, half in awe, half in fear. The figure smiled, and her voice was like bells muffled in snow. "I am Snowtail. Some call me the Winterlight Visitor. I come where light is carried, even when shadows try to put it out." Cinderella clutched the broom, her heart hammering. I had no invitation. The others went to dance. I have only this candle. And that, Snowtail said softly, nodding toward the trembling flame, is enough. You lit your own way. Now let me show you what waits when courage and kindness burn together. With a flick of her tail, Frost shimmered through the air, swirling around the pantry. A cracked teacup on the shelf rattled, then glowed. Its porcelain gleamed as though new, then stretched and curved until it stood as a tiny sleigh, its handle curled like a silver runner. Cinderella gasped. Snowtail touched the broom gently with her paw. In an instant, it split into golden threads that twined themselves into a gown. The fabric shimmered like spun frost, white, but not cold, threaded with silver that caught every flicker of candlelight. It draped over Cinderella's small frame until she shone as if clothed in moonlight itself. But my paws, Cinderella murmured. They were bare, smudged with ash. Snowtail only smiled. She lifted a sugar crystal from a bowl on the shelf, clear and sharp. With a tap of her paw, the crystal shimmered, softening into the shape of a slipper. She did the same with another, until 2 slippers of pure sugar rested in her paws, glowing faintly from within. Try them. Cinderella slid her feet inside. The sugar seemed to mold to her, sparkling like ice. Yet as soon as her paws touched them, they warmed. Soft, steady warmth that spread up through her fur. She laughed in wonder. They don't melt. Magic never melts when it is carried by light, Snowtail said gently. The candle flame leapt higher, as though in joy. Outside, the music rose. The midnight waltz was beginning. The ballroom filled with sound, with stomps and laughter, with bells ringing to mark the turning hour. Snowtail's eyes shone. The festival is not only for those with embroidered invitations. It is for every creature who carries warmth into the world. Go now, ride the sleigh. You will be seen. Cinderella hesitated, her paws clutching her gown. But if they find me here? Snowtail leaned close, her breath cool as winter wind. The only way to be unseen is to hide. Do not hide, little one. Tonight, carry your light into the open. With a flick of her frost-tipped tail, the teacup sleigh shimmered, its runners gleaming silver, its seat lined with a velvet red. 2 reindeer mice, gentle and sure-footed, appeared from the shadow of the pantry wall. Their fur glistened with frost, their antlers tipped in tiny sparks of ice. They bowed low, ready to pull the sleigh. Cinderella climbed in, her gown trailing like snowlight, her sugar slippers glowing with warmth. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small. She felt ready. Snowtail's cloak swirled around her, and she whispered, "Be back before the last bell at midnight. Magic can carry you far, but not beyond the hour." Cinderella nodded, her heart steady now. "I will remember." The sleigh gave a gentle lurch, then glided across the pantry floor, through the corridor, and out into the snowy night. The reindeer mice pulled with grace, their antlers scattering frost that glittered like falling stars. And behind her, in the pantry hearth, the candle burned on, its flame steady, carrying her promise forward. Part 7. The Midnight Waltz. The teacup sleigh skimmed across the snow as though it had wings. The reindeer mice leapt lightly, their antlers scattering silver sparks with every stride. Frosty air whipped past, sharp and clean, but Cinderella's sugar slippers glowed with steady warmth, keeping her paws as comfortable as if she sat beside a hearth. Her gown shimmered like moonlight woven with frost, trailing behind her in silver ribbons. The castle grew brighter with every heartbeat. Its towers glowed with lanterns, its windows sang with music, and the bells in the highest spire tolled to mark the hour. The Winter Light Festival had reached its height. At the grand doors, the sleigh slowed to a graceful stop. Castle mice and town mice turned, their whiskers lifting, their eyes wide. None had seen a sleigh so small or so splendid, its runners gleaming like silver threads, its antlered reindeer bowing low as though in greeting. And none had seen a mouse so radiant. Cinderella stepped down, her gown shimmering, her sugar slippers casting sparks across the stone. For a breath, the crowd hushed. Then they bowed, believing a guest of great honor had arrived. Some princess of frost, some lady of lanterns. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers blazed with 100 candles. The air was thick with the scent of spice, cider, and garlands of pine. Music rose, violins like falling snow, flutes like winter birds, drums like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The Prince of Bells, tall among mice, stood waiting at the center of the floor. His cloak was trimmed in frost, and around his neck hung a silver bell that gleamed faintly in the candlelight. When he saw her, his expression softened into wonder. He stepped forward, bowed low, and offered his paw. "Will you dance?" Cinderella's breath caught. She had never been asked before, not to dance, not to be seen. Yet the warmth in his voice steadied her. She placed her paw in his. The music swelled, and together they began to waltz. Round and round they moved, her gown spinning like a snowfall caught in wind, his steps sure and steady. The chandeliers scattered light across them, gilding their fur in silver and gold. Everywhere they passed, whispers followed. Who is she? Where has she come from? But to Cinderella, the questions did not matter. What mattered was the rhythm, the music, and the way the prince listened. When she laughed, he smiled as though he had been waiting all evening for that sound. When she spoke of the hearthlight she kept, he listened as though her words were treasures. He asked no questions of rank, of riches, of birth, only of her hopes, her kindness, her songs. Around them, mice stepped aside, watching. Some clapped to the beat, others whispered their awe. Yet no one interrupted, for the prince danced with no one else. His eyes, warm as bells, were only for her. The bells above the hall chimed softly, counting the minutes. The sound mingled with the violins, blending into a music that seemed woven of both earth and sky. The floor gleamed beneath them, polished smooth as ice, reflecting every turn of her slippers. Cinderella felt no weight, no ash, no burden. She felt only lightness, as though the flame in her chest had grown into wings. At last, the music slowed. The violins sighed, the flutes trilled, the drums gave one last beat, the dancers bowed. The hall erupted in cheers. But the prince did not let go of her paw. He held it gently, his voice soft enough only she could hear. "When the last bell strikes, promise me you will not vanish." Her smile trembled. She wished with all her heart she could promise. But in her ears rang Snowtail's warning. "Before midnight, you must return." The bells above stirred again, heavier now. 11 chimes echoed, rolling through the castle like distant thunder. Cinderella bowed, her gown sweeping the floor. "Thank you for the dance," she whispered, and before he could stop her, she slipped from his grasp. The prince stepped forward, calling, but the crowd pressed around him, questions flying. By the time he reached the doorway, she was gone, her gown only a shimmer down the corridor, her sugar slippers tapping like bells on stone. The sleigh waited outside. The reindeer mice pawed the snow, ready. She climbed in, her heart still glowing, still trembling. And as the sleigh swept her away into the night, the 12th bell began to toll. Part 8. The Clock and the Candle. The air outside the ballroom was sharp with frost, each breath a puff of cloud before Cinderella's whiskers. She clutched her gown as she ran, her sugar slippers striking sparks on the stone floor. Behind her, voices called. Laughter rang. The music swelled again, but she did not turn back. The great bells in the tower stirred, their heavy tones rolling through the night. 11 had already struck. The 12th would come soon. Snowtail's warning echoed in her ears. Magic can carry you far, but not beyond the hour. She darted into the corridor, her gown brushing against garlands that spilled pine scent into the air. The candlelight wavered, chasing her shadow along the walls. For a moment she slowed, catching her breath, pressing a paw to her chest. The flame inside her own heart's light, still burned steady, though fear tried to smother it. "I must go," she whispered. "I must go now." The sleigh waited in the courtyard, its runners glittering with frost, the reindeer mice stamping the snow as if urging her to hurry. The cracked teacup, now shimmering with silver trim, gleamed in the moonlight. But the bells rang again, deep, resounding, like the heartbeat of the castle itself. Dong. She lifted her skirts, sprinting down the steps. Dong. Her gown began to shimmer strangely, its silver threads loosening like strands of frost melting. Dong. The reindeer mice pawed harder, tossing their heads, bells at their collars jingling with urgency. Dong. Her slippers flickered, their sugar edges crumbling, then knitting themselves back together in bursts of light. Dong. She reached the courtyard, snowflakes swirling around her in dizzying spirals. The sleigh dipped low, ready. Dong. She scrambled in, her breath catching, her gown already thinning into mist. The reindeer mice lunged forward, runners slicing across the snow. Dong. The sleigh sped from the castle gates, sparks of frost trailing behind. Cinderella looked back once, just once, at the golden windows blazing with music and lanterns. The prince still stood in the doorway, his eyes searching, his paw outstretched toward the night. Dong. Her gown unraveled into silver dust, leaving only her plain smock beneath. The sugar slippers shattered into light, then dissolved, yet somehow her paws remained warm, as though the magic lingered in memory. Dong. The sleigh jerked suddenly, shrinking as it raced, the cracked porcelain returning, the velvet fading. By the time it skidded to a halt on the snowy road beyond the castle, it was no larger than a teacup once more. Dong. The reindeer mice vanished in a shimmer of frost, their antlers scattering one last spark before the air closed around them. Dong. Silence fell, save for her own ragged breathing and the whisper of snow. She stumbled from the teacup, her paws bare, her smock smudged with ash. Only one thing remained unchanged: the candle she had carried. Somehow it had returned to her apron pocket, its flame burning softly, undisturbed by wind or snow. The 12th bell rang at last, echoing across the hills, and with it the final threads of magic melted away. The sleigh was only porcelain again. The gown was gone. The slippers were dust. Cinderella fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the candle close. Its light glowed on her fur, gentle, steady. Though all else had vanished, this flame remained, her own, lit by her own paws, carried by her own heart. She whispered to it, her breath trembling, "Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost." And though the castle bells tolled their last, though the music behind her swelled with joy she could no longer touch, the flame did not waver. It burned for her. She stood, gathered her strength, and began the walk home. Behind her, on the snowy road, one thing remained where the sleigh had rested: a faint shimmer, as if frost had caught her reflection and kept it. The snow sparkled with her image, glowing softly in the moonlight. And somewhere in the distance, the Prince of Bells saw it gleam. Part 9. The search begins. The castle bells gave their last heavy chime, and the ballroom fell into a hush. The dancers turned, tails swishing, eyes searching. Whispers rippled like wind through wheat. Where had she gone? Who was she? At the center of it all, the Prince of Bells stood alone, his paw still half lifted, as though reaching for the hand that had slipped away. His heart rang hollow, like a bell struck, but silenced too soon. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the questions, the curious stares. He searched every corner of the hall, every shadowed corridor. But there was no sign of the mysterious guest. No silver gown, no shimmering slippers. Only a trail of faint frost dusted the floor, melting quickly into nothing. He hurried outside. The courtyard was empty now, save for the snow swirling in restless eddies. But there, on the road leading away from the castle, something caught his eye. In the snow lay a shimmer, faint but steady. It was not a footprint, not a thread of fabric. It was light itself, woven into the frost. A reflection, a memory, a trace of the dancer who had fled. He knelt, brushing it gently with his paw. As he touched it, the light bloomed, forming the smallest image, her. A vision of the radiant mouse who had danced with him, her smile tender, her eyes bright with kindness. It lasted only a heartbeat, then faded into sparkles, but it was enough. The prince's breath caught. It was real, he whispered. She was real. He stood, his silver bell glinting against his chest, and called to his attendants, who had followed him in confusion. Search the castle. Search the town. Search every hearth and every pantry. Find the one who carries this light. The attendants bowed low, for they had seen the shimmer too. How will we know her, my lord? One asked. The prince held out his paw, where the faintest sparkle still clung. You will know her when this light answers her touch. No other can hold it. So the search began. Messengers were sent down every corridor, into the kitchens, into the servant halls. Others rushed into the snowy streets, where town mice lingered near their sleds, warming paws by lanterns. The prince himself walked among them, the frost trace cupped carefully in his paw. At each door he stopped, showing the light. Touch it, he asked gently. Does it know you? Mouse after mouse placed a paw upon the sparkle. It glowed faintly, then dimmed, unresponsive. The prince would thank them kindly and move on. For though many were gracious, none stirred the shimmer into life. Thistle and Poppy were quick to thrust themselves forward, their cloaks glittering, their paws eager. "It must be me," Thistle declared. "Everyone saw how brightly I danced." "No, me," Poppy insisted. He smiled at me twice. But when they pressed their paws against the shimmer, it flickered once and died, dull as snow turned to slush. The prince shook his head, bowing politely. "It is not you." The sisters bristled, tails twitching, but he had already turned away. He felt the truth like a pull, like a bell drawing him onward. Somewhere close, the one he sought still carried her light. At last, the search led to the quiet pantry at the edge of the castle, the place few thought to look, the place where the hearth's warmth lingered strongest. The door was half open, and the smell of bread and ash drifted out. The prince stepped inside. It was dim, save for a single candle burning in a small glass cup. Its light was plain, almost humble. Yet when he drew closer, the sparkle in his paw leapt like a flame meeting its twin. There, sweeping the floor with steady strokes, was Cinderella. Her smock was simple, her fur smudged with ash, but her eyes lifted, wide and steady. The prince stopped. The shimmer in his paw grew bright, spilling light across the pantry stones, casting her reflection on every wall. And in that glow, he knew. Part 10. The Transformation. The pantry glowed with light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The single candle flickered in its cup, but the shimmer in the prince's paw had flared into brilliance, spilling across the stone walls until even the flour sacks looked like marble. Even the broom's handle gleamed like gold. Cinderella froze where she stood, her paws still curled around the broom. Ash dusted her fur. Her smock was plain, yet the light wrapped around her as though claiming her. For the first time, she was seen not in spite of her quiet work, but because of it. The prince stepped closer, holding the shimmer carefully between his paws. "It is you," he said softly. His voice carried no doubt, no question. It was as steady as the bells themselves. "You are the one I danced with. You are the one the light remembers." Her breath caught, but I have no invitation, no cloak, no jewels. She looked down at her simple smock, then back at the candle. "I have only this flame." The prince's smile was gentle, almost reverent. "Then you have everything. The slipper of sugar, the gown of frost. Those were wonders, yes. But this light, it came from you, not from magic, from you." The words wrapped around her like a cloak, heavier than any cloth, warmer than any fire. She clutched the broom tighter, her heart trembling. And then the air shimmered again. A swirl of frost danced across the hearth, and from its glow stepped Snowtail. Her cloak glistened, her fur white as snowfall, her tail trailing frost that melted into sparkles on the stones. "You carried it well," Snowtail said, her eyes bright. She looked to the prince, then back to Cinderella. "The choice is here, as it was always meant to be." Cinderella swallowed, her whiskers trembling. "Choice?" Snowtail nodded. "You may remain as you are, gentle keeper of the hearth, candle-lighting mouse, unseen yet steady. Or if your heart wishes, you may change. You may step into the wider world, become more than fur and whiskers, more than pantry and broom. The festival is only one night, but the light you carry can burn across a lifetime. The room hushed, as though even the embers held their breath. Cinderella looked down at her paws, small, nimble, ash-stained. She thought of the years spent sweeping, mending, singing quietly to embers. She thought of Thistle's sharp laughter, Poppy's mocking smile. She thought, too, of the town mice's sleds, of the garlands, of the lanterns strung like stars. She thought of the prince, his kindness steady, his listening eyes warm. Her gaze returned to the candle. The flame trembled, then steadied, as if waiting on her answer. "I will not let the light go out," she whispered, "but I wish to carry it further. I wish to become more." Snowtail's smile deepened. "Then so you shall." She lifted her frost-tipped tail and brushed it gently over Cinderella's shoulders. At once the pantry blazed with silver light. Ash fell away from her fur like shed skin. Her smock unraveled into threads of frost and reformed into a gown, not of moonlight this time, but of hearthlight. Warm gold stitched with deep red, like fire caught in fabric. Her paws stretched, her frame grew taller, and before their eyes, she was no longer only a mouse. She was human, small and slender, her hair dark as chestnuts, her eyes shining with the same kindness that had once glowed in a mouse's face. The sugar slippers reformed at her feet, no longer brittle crystal, but shoes of ice that glowed with steady warmth. The prince fell to his knees, bowing his head in awe. Snowtail bowed too, her cloak rippling like snowfall. Cinderella stood trembling, clutching her gown. Her voice was still the same, gentle, soft, steady. "I am still me," she whispered. "Yes," Snowtail said, "only larger. Only ready." The candle flame leapt high, then steadied, as if in agreement. Cinderella looked at the prince, her smile fragile but true. He lifted his head, his eyes full of wonder, and whispered, "You are the one I searched for. And now the world will know what I already saw." Snowtail stepped back, fading slowly, her cloak dissolving into frost and light. "Carry it well," she whispered one last time. "Carry your own light." Then she was gone, leaving only the glow of the hearth and the candle, steady and bright. And Cinderella, no longer only a mouse, stood in the light of her own choice, ready for what came next. Part 11. The Winter Wedding. The winter castle awoke to a morning unlike any other. Snow lay soft and deep across the courtyards, yet the bells rang clear and strong, carrying far into the hills. The festival was ended, but a new celebration had begun. Word spread swiftly. The mysterious guest of the midnight waltz had been found. She was no stranger princess, no foreign lady cloaked in frost. She was the hearth's own keeper, the small, quiet one who had carried her light when no one else saw it. Now she stood tall, her gown gleaming with gold and red, her eyes steady as candle flames. She was Cinderella, mouse no longer, but maiden of the hearth, chosen and seen. The Prince of Bells announced the wedding would be held that very night, in the castle courtyard beneath the winter sky. Not for grandeur, not for pomp, but so all might witness what kindness could become when it was carried faithfully. The castle mice scurried in excitement, stringing new garlands of holly and pine, polishing bells until they shone like silver moons. Town mice fetched berries and nuts, while the humans of the castle laid long tables with bread and cider. Lanterns were hung from every window, their glow falling onto the snow like a scatter of stars. Cinderella herself worked alongside them, her hands gentle and sure. She kneaded dough with the bakers, carried kindling with the servants, tied ribbons with the youngest mice. Though she wore a gown fit for a queen, she laughed when flour dusted her sleeves, smiled when cider splashed her wrist, for she had not forgotten the hearth where she began, and never would. At twilight, the bells rang again, deeper and fuller than before. The courtyard filled, castle mice, town mice, humans, even the reindeer mice who had once pulled the sleigh. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, catching on cloaks and whiskers, shimmering in the lantern light. The prince waited at the heart of it all, his cloak plain now, his bell polished bright. When Cinderella stepped forward, the crowd hushed. She walked not with grandeur, but with grace, her sugar slippers leaving glowing prints on the snow. Her candle still burning in its glass cup, she carried in her hands. The two met beneath the great bell that hung at the courtyard's arch, the one that rang in times of joy. Together they placed their paws, now hands, upon the flame, and it grew brighter, lighting their faces. "Kindness is a light," the prince said softly, repeating the words she had whispered to herself so often. "And tonight, we promise to carry it together." A cheer rose, rising high into the winter night. Bells rang from every tower, voices joined in carol, and the snow seemed to sparkle with delight. The feast began, bread broken and shared, cider poured, sugared nuts passed from paw to hand. Music played again, not only violins and flutes, but voices singing together. The younger mice danced in circles, tails twining, while the older ones clapped in rhythm. Humans joined them, laughing, lowering their hands to dance with partners small as thimbles. Even Thistle and Poppy, who had once mocked and sneered, found themselves caught in the warmth. At first they lingered at the edges, their whiskers twitching uneasily. But Cinderella beckoned them close, offering them bread and a place at her side. Slowly, awkwardly, they joined. Their sharpness softened, their laughter changed. For in the glow of so much light, even hard hearts could thaw. Lady Corvina, stern elder of the castle mice, wiped her eyes and muttered, "Well, perhaps I was wrong." But her voice shook with something close to pride. And through it all, Cinderella stood radiant. Not because of her gown, not because of her crown, but because the light she had carried in secret now burned openly, shared with all. The night stretched long, filled with song and story, with bells and snow, with warmth that no frost could smother. The winter castle, once only stone and shadow, seemed alive with joy. At last, when the final bell tolled midnight, the prince and Cinderella lit one more lantern together. They placed it in the snow at the courtyard's center, and all others lowered their own flames to light from it. Soon the courtyard shone with 100 small fires, each one a promise, each one a memory. And so, the winter wedding was not just theirs, but everyone's, a union of hearth and hall, of kindness and courage, of mice and humans, of light carried and shared. Part 12. The Hearth Light Tradition. Years passed, but the winter castle never forgot. Each season the snow returned, each year the lanterns were hung, each festival glowed with song and bells. And each time the mice and humans alike remembered the one who had once carried her light when no invitation came. In the pantry corner, The hearth where Cinderella had swept so many nights still burned steadily. There, upon the stones, a single candle was kept in its glass cup. No matter the storm outside, no matter the frost at the windows, that flame was never allowed to die. Servants lit it at dusk, mice tended it at dawn, and travelers bowed their heads when they passed. It was called the hearth light, and it was said to honor the courage of one who had carried kindness into the world. Children, both mouse and human, would gather near it each winter, eager to hear the story told again. Elders would sit them down, voices low and steady, and speak of the night Cinderella lit her own flame and was found by it. They told how she danced with the Prince of Bells, how she chose to carry her light further, and how together they kindled warmth for all. Sometimes the candle flame flickered as the story was told, as if it remembered too. Above in the great hall, a sugar slipper rested on the mantel, its crystal facets catching the firelight. Beside it hung a silver bell. These were kept not as trophies, but as reminders that magic was not in the objects themselves, but in the heart that had once worn and wrung them true. Cinderella herself walked among the people, not always as a queen in gown and crown, but often in simple cloak and gloves, pausing to help mend a garment, light a lantern, carry a basket. Those who looked closely swore her slippers of ice never truly left her feet, glowing faintly even beneath the snow, keeping her steady and warm. Thistle and poppy grew gentler with time. Though their pride never fully faded, they learned to set bread on tables, to string garlands without complaint. They, too, lit candles each winter, whispering wishes into the flame. And perhaps, in their own way, they carried the lesson of their sister. Snowtail was rarely seen again, but sometimes when frost crept along the windows in patterns too fine to be chance, the mice would murmur, "She is near." A shimmer of silver at the edge of vision, a whisper in the chimney smoke. These were enough to remind them that magic lingers where kindness dwells. So the tradition grew. At the Festival of Winter Light, each family, mouse and human alike, carried a candle from their own hearth. They brought them to the courtyard, where the great bell waited, and placed them side by side. Hundreds of small flames flickered, a sea of light against the snow, proof that no one flame was ever alone. And when the bells rang at midnight, the candles shone brighter, as if answering. In the quiet that followed, when music faded and snow muffled every sound, a hush would fall. Parents would lift their children close, whispering the words that had once been whispered to Cinderella by her mother. Kindness is a light. Carry it, and you will never be lost. And the children, wide-eyed, would nod solemnly, as though taking a vow. So it was that the winter castle became more than stone walls and frosted towers. It became a place of memory, of promise, of warmth that outlasted cold. And those who lit their lanterns there carried the glow home, into cottages and burrows, into bakeries and barns, into hidden corners where darkness once lingered. And always, the hearth light burned in the pantry, steady and sure, as though the flame itself remembered the little mouse who once believed her candle was enough. It had been, it always would be,